Okay, I'm gonna start with my brief intro because I'm gonna let Austin mostly describe his background to you himself. But I just wanted to share up top that as the mentors have been filling out various Google forms in different corners of the internet, and the list keeps, forms have been going around and people have been signing up. I've been so curious to read about people's backgrounds and what's motivating them and things like that. And I was really thrilled because one of the projects that I did when I was coming out of graduate school and I was making this big career transition from academic work to industry work, I taught myself, in order to teach myself a little bit more Python and get a little more familiar with data visualization tools, I did this little small project to teach myself some D3, which was a tool that if you've ever seen any of like the New York Times, those very beautiful data visualizations that they make, that's one of the core tools underpinning a lot of that. Anyway, so for me personally, it's always been an element of my work as an academic and that I've sort of carried as a through line from sort of my before career to my now career. And so I was so excited when I saw Austin's background pop appear in the list of mentors because I think the stuff that he's worked on is really interesting, and the places where he's chosen to apply it, I also think is really exciting. I'm going to let him take the mic and talk more about that. And yeah, I'm going to hand it over to you now, Austin. But thanks again up top for making the time to share with everybody today.
Yeah, totally. Excited to be here and excited to chat a little bit more. I think I see about 21 of us in here, and so I think this is a good size group, but I think I'm very open to like questions, raising hands, coming off mute and things like that. So as we talk about stuff, aiming to have, you know, about 30-ish, maybe a little bit more of content. So I want some leaving time that we can dive into some pieces. I'll talk a little bit more about my background. I think I really think about data viz in the context of thinking about kind of the wider picture of how does visualizations fit into a wider idea of storytelling or trying to get your point across. And so I'm going to couch that a little bit in kind of what this wider idea of visual storytelling is. Talk about some of like the major tooling that people use, and then I'm just going to kind of like briefly walk through kind of a random assortment of projects I've worked on and talk about a little bit more of the kind of underpinning and the background and the tools used. And can kind of let us do a little bit of choose your own adventure with some more questions and have some other material that I probably won't start with, but we might get to at some point. As I get going, would love to see maybe in the chat as well. I'm just very curious what people are working on. So maybe as I get started, if folks don't mind just giving me like your elevator pitch, one sentence, like what type of projects I think can um, uh, love to see that and can kind of build that in as we do things. So as I pull up the slides, I will love to see some comments in the chat. Okay, let's see. Great. Okay, can people, oh, and I've lost the chat.
Oh yeah, there you go. Yeah, so if you have a just a quick project ex idea, just yeah, exactly. Andrea, computer vision for recycling sorting. Right. So just at the level of a few words, what's everybody in here working on? That way Austin can get an idea what is most helpful for people. There you go.
Yeah,
Thanks.
nice. Cool. Great. Okay, I'll keep an eye on that. And legislative promise tracker. Cool, cool. Nice. Bills initiatives, Vera. Very cool. Cool, sweet. Okay, so a little bit about me. My name's Austin. You can check out some website here and some stuff. I'll talk about some stuff on there as well. I think a lot of the things that I have worked on have been thinking about um, how we think about using technology as a means to an end to work on projects and tell stories that I think are meaningful and important. Currently, I work at the Council on Foreign Relations. We're a foreign policy think tank. We work primarily on U.S. interests abroad. It's a very wide category of things. I like to say we're 50% think tank doing reports and research, and we have experts on staff that come from government and academia on a variety of issues. And we're about 50% publisher kind of newsroom where we have editors and writers and audience people that produce original content that's mostly explainers and articles. The idea is that when there's a big foreign policy topic, wanting to kind of have a source of truth to both understand what's happening in the moment, but in context around the issue. So, for example, there's last week, bleeding into the weekend, into this week, has been a deal with Iran and the US. And so doing some work on that. I do kind of a variety of graphics at CFR. And so this is everything from graphics that go in other people's writing. So things like supporting experts, writing articles or writing reports, explainers that we produce, longer form immersive storytelling that's more original storytelling, as well as making graphics for a variety of audiences, whether it's for online or for print or also for our social media. You can follow us on Instagram, CFR_org. All those graphics are stuff that I work on as well. Before that, I've done kind of a weird assortment of things. Lots of people, the more I get into kind of the, graphics, data journalism type world, people come from all different types of backgrounds. And so I think that's one common, and there's not really quite a way there. Most recently, I was in grad school studying computer science and public policy in Chicago. Did a lot of work at a research center that worked on science of cities type things. So I worked on um, kind of computational tooling and research on bus service, landlord networks, property taxes, deeds and inheritance, and things like that. And so these are projects in which worked with journalists or worked with researchers to do kind of large scale data pipelines or analysis or research to understand these different topics. Also worked a little bit as a data editor at a newsroom at school as well, working on projects. Before that, I worked in analytics. I did political fundraising analytics at the DNC. So all those annoying emails and text messages that you've been getting, worked on kind of some of the analytics behind that. Mostly, small dollar fundraising. These aren't like millionaires giving hundreds of $1,000s, but this is like someone donating $20, things like that. And before that, I did worked at a nonprofit and did helped run like a civics program. And so a lot of the work that really got me interested in thinking about how we use technology to improve things and really tell stories that matter started working, in my hometown, working with young people and thinking about what does it mean to build agency and understand your community and the issues around me. And I think that has kind of, driven a lot of the work that I've done over the years. Great. So like I said, I think I want to just kind of like set the scene a little bit. I think when we talk about data viz, I think about data viz as kind of one piece of a bigger puzzle, and I think that's how I'm going to kind of spin this a little bit. So hopefully I don't bamboozle you too much. But I think when we think about visual storytelling, this is kind of things in which we're thinking about the way that we're communicating data, communicating individual stories to a wider audience. I think traditionally, I think what people think about of this is like when you go to the New York Times and there's a chart and there's a graphic, and this is kind of your main way that you're communicating data. This might be maps as well, at explaining where something is or where strikes have taken place or where, a road is blocked or things like that. But I think when we think about like all the pieces that go into visual storytelling, I think there's a lot more pieces that all feed into, I think, what is like a modern sense of what data visualization is. This idea that data takes a lot of different forms, and the way that we communicate that with different audiences looks a lot of different ways. And with the internet these days, where most people get their news, most people get information, not in print anymore, but on the internet and primarily on their phones, not even on desktops as well. And so there's lots of interesting different things that allows us to do. And so when I think about data viz and storytelling, I think one is to think wider than just, charts and maps, but also images and videos and illustrations and narrative and scrolly telling and diagrams and writing. And so I think when you think about the role that data has and the way you visualize it, I think thinking about that not in isolation, but as part of a bigger picture of what story are you trying to tell is kind of really what I want to drill home today, I think. Um, I think, like I'm saying, visuals is really like in service to a good story. I think any type of data viz or any type of chart, I think the things that make it successful at communicating what we're trying to communicate is often some part, the visual looks nice and you picked a good chart and you made it look nice. But I think oftentimes the work has been done to think about what is the point of this? What is the underlying story? What is the compelling thing about this? And also, who is this for? And how do I craft a visual that's made for a specific point or a specific audience? And so I think these are just some kind of overview questions that I always think are really important to ask that I think sometimes can get lost in translation from people that are doing maybe beginning to do graphics in school or doing it in a research setting or doing it for a class, and then trying to think about switching and making those graphics for an audience or for out for the world or for news in which I do a lot of things. And so I think as you're starting to make something, some questions that are just important are thinking about what's the point of this? So is this an investigation in which you're trying to show some type of new data that has not been shown or new analysis that hasn't been done? Is this advocacy? You're trying to make a point or convince someone of something? Is this educational? You're trying to explain and have an explanatory. I think all of these result in different graphic decisions, design decisions, data decisions, layout decisions. And so thinking about what's kind of the goal here with what I'm creating. Second one that I think is intertwined is who's your audience? I think this is a question that's not asked enough when people make most things on the internet, but is this for yourself, which is totally fine. I've talked about some personal projects today that was something I just wanted to make. Is this for others? Is this for experts? Is this for what people like to say general audience, which maybe is a word that kind of means nothing? And so I think thinking about who is the type of person? Is it something that you want to come to that has no clue about the topic and you want to kind of start from zero and you want to get them up to speed? Is it someone that's an expert in the issue and you're being able to dive into the jargon and the terminology and they're going to know what you mean and you're kind of providing an extra layer of analysis? And so again, all of these questions I think are really ways to kind of help you think about all of these other pieces that go around building visuals. Um, like I kind of touched on, I think a lot about this like exploratory versus explanatory framing, especially folks that come out of like a school setting. I think oftentimes the graphics you're making for a class or for a report or things like that are much often more in the exploratory. You're making something quick in ggplot or Google Sheets, and you're just trying to understand the data you have. And I think there's an important role for that. You can think about like dashboards or things like that, or in some, different context, you want to see it all and you want to go through it. But I think oftentimes what is more impactful or what people think of when they look at, journalism or New York Times or maybe some of these other more popular data viz that you see out in the world is that these are often more explanatory. There's a point to be made here. There's something that you're trying to get through to the audience. And so thinking about shifting, and is this an exploratory visual or an explanatory visual, and which one do you want it to be? And then lastly is thinking about what your focus. I think kind of mentioned with the audience as well, but I think there's ways to think about broad or narrow. Do you need to explain everything about a topic to get them to where they need to be? Or is it something in which you can kind of drop someone in and you're having a very narrow focus? And so these are just some of the questions that I think are really helpful to frame when you think about building visuals. Um, and then on the flip side, kind of more of the less of the qualitative in terms of what we think about all the questions that you should be asking. I think something that I wish I had getting into this work is just like a lay of the land of the tools of like what you do to make these things and like what is the New York Times doing when they make some crazy graphic and you're like, in what world could that exist on the internet? And so I think the way that I think about, again, kind of this wider bucket of visual storytelling, I think can be broken up into a few different bits. And I think some industries, some people, again, kind of coming from this from a more, newsroom journalism world, is that a lot of people that do graphics kind of do a bunch of different pieces of the puzzle. At different places, you might be kind of doing one piece of this. But I think with all kind of good visual storytelling and with data viz, one piece of this is always the data. And so this is kind of what is the underlying, this might be, your traditional spreadsheets or things like that. This might be geospatial data. This might be individual stories. There's kind of lots of different ways that this could look. Um, you know, Lots of different tooling. I think this is the one in which whatever gets the job done is totally good. People have love to have lots of strong opinions about like, oh, I prefer Python or I prefer R or Excel or things like this. I think I'm a firm believer of whatever you're comfortable with and know how to use and are interested in is a good tool, as you can get to the answer you need. So um, I like to use Python. That's just I learned it in school and I find it helpful for other things, but day to day in work, I mostly use Sheets because a lot of it is pivoting and grouping, and that gets the job done. There's no reason to pull out the more complicated tools. So that's one piece of it. The second one I think is I think when we start thinking about some of the more complicated visuals, we start thinking about storytelling, we start thinking about uh, this idea of like interactives or scrolly telly that's kind of becoming more popular on the web these days. I think there's a piece of data viz work that can also be, web development work is what I'm putting web dev on here. People also call this like front end or front end engineering is another term that might come up. This is kind of the part of the internet and websites, in which is kind of the graphical design, kind of what you see when you go to the screen. And so the kind of base of the internet of what makes web pages work is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which you may or may not be familiar with. HTML is a language that kind of defines the structure of the page. CSS is kind of a language that helps define the visual style, so being able to apply colors and stroke and font and things like that. And JavaScript is a scripting language that's used to interact with things on the page programmatically. And so this is like things like clicking a button or something happens as you scroll. And so things to dynamically change the page is used there. There's then a layer on top of this. These second two are just two examples, Svelte and React. The web development world is a deep, dark world that has really had no standardization over the last like 30 years. And so new tooling exists every couple of years. It's not quite something like more data work or machine learning work where people have kind of coalesced around Python or a certain language or things like that. So these are called frameworks. These are languages that sit on top of kind of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. You can think of them as like packages in other languages that help uh, do different parts of web development and can dig more into this at another point, but I'll leave it there. Um, I'll come back to this last AI to HTML one. So
Sorry,
with,
Austin, I just want to
yeah.
interrupt because I'm are you sharing your screen?
Oh, am I not?
You're not. No.
Oh,
It's been so interesting. I've really been enjoying
sorry.
it. I'm
Wow.
so impressed. I'm like, oh my gosh, Austin is like doing such a great job,
That
like
is great to
extemporaneously
know.
just like going through all this stuff. But then I was like, wait, I think he is referring
I
to
am
like a list.
totally.
I
Well,
think
you've
all this
missed
other
all
stuff,
my.
I don't think you need to go back. I'm really
Yeah, yeah.
sorry. I should have clocked that sooner. But I actually was like, wow, this is so good and so compelling. I'm really impressed at the lack
No
of
worries.
visuals.
I'll share the slides after you can see them.
Yes, we'll make all of this public for everybody. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Apologies for that. I think of
No, no,
slides
no.
as
It's my fault. I should have
no,
clocked that
no.
sooner. Yeah.
Well, the slides are what I said, so there's not
Yes,
a whole lot
exactly.
more. Think of them as more markers. But if you're a visual person, which I assume maybe you are because you're here, a nice little diagram is always helpful. So anyway, talked about the first one on the left, data. Talked about this middle one, web dev. I think, can I see, we all see my screen now. Okay. This third one that I think is another piece of this is design work. I think again, like I said, in different roles, you might be doing one piece of this. At a really big organization, at a small organization, you might be doing all of this. In my role, I do a little bit of all of these. Design work is something that I don't have necessarily a training in. Some people come from more of that background. This is also a very dark, not dark, but a very deep world of tools and skills and history around design work. I'll just call out two main kind of programs that people use. I think Adobe Illustrator is the more traditional one that's been used for a very long time. This is basically like a graphical program through the Adobe suite that allows you to interact and create graphics and create SVG-based graphics that then are used if you see any type of something that's like a really beautiful map or something that's like a huge diagram, or if you can think about like National Geographic, like full page diagrams or science, um, forget what the big science one is called, but these kind of big infographics, a lot of those most likely made in Illustrator. Figma, who maybe many of you have heard, is kind of the new kid on the block that's kind of very similar in spirit to Illustrator, but is a little bit more user-friendly in my opinion, has some features, makes it a little bit easier to do design work. But ultimately, all of these are used both in prototyping, sketching, kind of making drafts, but also used to make final versions of being able to do really custom tweaks, pixel perfect placement of exactly where you want it to be. And then last thing on here, really big in design is just like a pencil and a piece of paper. I think just sketching things and getting ideas out, whiteboarding and things like that is such a big piece of design. And so adding that on here as well, because that's such a huge piece of design work. And then I think there is this kind of emerging piece kind of in modern data viz storytelling of some tooling that makes help with data viz makes it a little bit easier. And so these are tools that you may or may not be familiar with. And so these are tools that kind of help the creation of what I call like your standard graphics much quicker. You can think about like your bar charts and your line charts and things like that that allow you to have some standardized spacing and fonts and best practices all kind of wrapped in. So when you make a chart, it kind of gives you a very rational, good layout without a lot of effort, and you can make things very quickly. If you ever wonder, like, news breaks and there's a New York Times graphic like 5 minutes later, and you're like, how could they possibly do that quickly? It's almost always a data wrapper graphic is the tool that they use. Flourish is another tool that's very similar to Data Wrapper. The idea here is that it's a website, it's free, you can get upgraded paid versions, but it's free. You can upload a CSV or an Excel sheet, and you can do some kind of point and click styling and get a very good looking graphic. These do nice things like being responsive, meaning if someone's on their phone, it resizes and things like that. We use Data Wrapper for kind of a lot of graphics that we do because they look good and they're quick. The other one that was just mentioned earlier as well is D3. They have kind of this weird logo here. This is a tool that is used another like long history and world of D3. This is again a JavaScript package. If you've used like Python or R, this is like this idea of like basically like an add-on. Someone has written code that allows you to kind of um, do things a little bit quicker. And this gives you a lot of control. It's based on creating SVGs, which are scalable vector graphics. And this allows you to have a lot of kind of deep custom control. There's kind of a long history of data viz people really adopting this tool to be able to use data, use a CSV to define the size of bars or lines and stuff like that. And also being in JavaScript allows you kind of do some more interactions and things like that and make it interactive. A lot more tools with data viz that people use, but just kind of calling out these ones that I find the industry being more coalescing around. And so these are kind of the big ones I would say that people use. Any questions or clarifications or anything? I'll pause here now that the screen is out. Do I have the chat? Let's see. I don't know if I have the chat anymore. Oh, there we go.
I'm going to
I don't
drop my now
guys.
13 years old D3 like project I did to teach myself
Nice.
D3
Love
into
it.
the chat so people can see it.
Yeah, I would say I can't remember when a few years ago New York Times hired the creator of D3, and so they still use it a lot.
I wouldn't start with it though.
No, no, totally. Yeah, I think it is not a, I would say, I think if you're coming from a technical background and you like to code and you want to enter it that way, definitely. But this is a tool that's used kind of on the far end of the spectrum for complete customization. That's famously not beginner friendly as well. And so I think more about using one of these kind of data wrapper or Flourish tools as well as starting out. Okay, I think in the spirit of visual storytelling, just gonna walk through kind of a few high-level projects, things that I've worked on like as a student or on side projects or smaller projects that I think things that I think are more closely equivalent to things that you all might be working on in more of a 4 or 8 week time span. And so I'm just gonna kind of breeze through these quickly, mentions a few of them, show some quick demos, but I think want to kind of leave some time at the end as well so that we can kind of dig into specific pieces or questions that people have. And so feel free to stop me at any time. I've got the chat up now, so if anyone wants to drop anything in the chat, I will see it. But yeah, so a quick aside, I think people talk a lot about I guess sorry, one thing that I didn't put on that data viz as one of the tools is things like R or Excel or Google Sheets or Python. I think these are like tools that a lot of people use for data viz, and I think it's great to be able to make graphics in tools that you already know. I think these can look great and work totally well. I think for getting things to kind of that next level up, I find that these are often not the best tools if you're trying to up your data viz game. And I think a few of the reasons of that is that while they're really great for exploratory, quick internal charts, I make like graphics in Google Sheets all the time to kind of see the data and think about what's the story. I think oftentimes they really struggle to translate well in terms of being able to make sure labels are big enough and that the fonts look good and that there's a little bit of design work and that kind of maybe the biggest downside of these, and maybe there's fixes to these I'm familiar with, but oftentimes the only export option is an image. And I think almost every report will show now that most people access the internet on their phone. And so if your graphic is not readable on a phone, it's hard to do much with that because that's how most people are probably going to see it. It's just kind of the reality of the situation. And so I think these are great tools to kind of explore and make stuff with, but I think trying out some of these other ones could be helpful if you're looking to put things in a more kind of final form, especially thinking about mobile. So that's kind of my take on that. But still use these all the time to make graphics as kind of first passes. Okay, so just gonna go through a few of these and have like kind of some big categories. This was something worked on in grad school. That was something that was something that was kind of in this category of like useful and simple that I thought. This was something in which there was kind of a quick problem at hand. I was trying to figure out where to vote, and I would Google, I was living in Chicago at the time, I would Google Chicago early voting locations, and there would just be a big long list of like places. And this was one in which I didn't know where any of them were, and I didn't want to like, I was like, which one's the closest to me? I didn't want to like go through and Google them. I was new to Chicago. I didn't know like the zip codes or the neighborhoods, so I couldn't quite like look at a list and figure it out. And so this is one where this was like a low-tech data process. I copied the list from the city and I geolocated them by hand. There was like 50 of them. I Googled them all and got coordinates for them. And basically like put them on a map. This is one that definitely could have just been a static map built with something like Data Wrapper or any of the other kind of mapping tools that you may have used in the past. This was one in which I had used kind of a online JavaScript based mapping platform called MapLibre, which I can talk about more later. But this was one in which kind of connecting this need that I was finding I was having, where there was no just like map of where all the early voting locations along with the hours to be able to do that quickly. So this was something that was trying to find like a simple problem and think about a quick turnaround and make something useful for me that I thought might be useful for others and keep it all simple. You know, this was just a data list. This ended up like being very popular. If you Googled like Chicago early voting, like this article would come up. It was like one of our top articles for the newspaper at the time, and it was something that was just kind of translating something that was a list on the internet into a more graphical form, just being a map. And so I think this is kind of one example of just like a simple project of sometimes kind of more educational or kind of explanatory or
Yeah.
sorry, exploratory of just being able to show where things are can be really helpful for people.
I think this is also a great example of something that's come up a few times in questions from the group, which is, do I have to build something completely new and totally unique? And I think oftentimes really great and useful projects come from like this sort of this kind of work where it's about translating something into a different format. It's about taking something that's kind of hard to find or kind of inaccessible or hard to combine with another source and just putting it into people's hands in a much more direct and relevant way and surfacing the most relevant information as opposed to all the information. And I think those are sometimes just really, really useful things to work on, and they involve quite a bit of learning and things like that. And you can, for your own benefit, still learn quite a bit, but not necessarily build something that no one's ever thought to build before or something like that. The novelty of it is not what makes it special.
Absolutely. If you've ever studied like, or more in academic sense, like things about civic technology or civic hackers or things like that, the famous example that's always used is also happens to be in Chicago, but there was snowplow data where people wanted to know if their street was snowplowed. And the city would put out these like really archaic website and this like weird data. And basically these people made a website that just showed a map of all the streets that had been plowed that day. And it was something that was so successful, the city ended up just using their website instead of the one that they had built. And so sometimes, like exactly what you're saying, it's just taking something existing and thinking a little bit more about who's the user here. How would I find this useful, and maybe making it adapt it a little bit. Also, I've linked on here, and I'll share the lights later. But I really try to like build in public as much as I can. So most of these projects are open source. So like all of the code is completely on GitHub and public. And so this whole project, you can download the code and recreate it and things like that. That's true for almost all of these. I can't do it as much as my current job, but I'm trying to convince them to let me. So there maybe hopefully will be more of that. Um, the second one is kind of maybe the other end of the spectrum where this was a very long year-long investigative project in which I was at a university. This is University of Chicago. This is in Hyde Park in South Chicago, and was a story in which we I lived right by the Trader Joe's, and the university I later found out owned the Trader Joe's, and I was so confused. I was like, why does the university own the Trader Joe's? So I started asking around, and turns out you can see all these maroon colored squares here. Um, those are all properties owned by the university, and so we did a little bit of a story of how did the university come to own a majority of the neighborhood. And so this is a story that was kind of much on the more complicated side. This was using the same mapping platform, but more of a scrolly telly piece. And so I think I'm still sharing my screen here, but this was a mixture of really kind of long form, exploratory, and try to explain what the story is. We basically go back to the beginning and use archival maps and things like that, and archival pictures to talk about the university and how it's grown over time and the role the university plays in shaping the neighborhood for better and for worse. Um, I think this is kind of the other end of the spectrum where I think this was a story that could have been a big, you think like, 2000 word article, but I think it's really thinking about there's some stories or some, data that really lends itself to be visual. We're talking about buildings the university owns and how they've expanded across the neighborhood. And I think really trying to think about where are there opportunities where kind of the visual aspect is screaming at you and is going to really be something that's going to help you understand the story at hand. And so I think there aren't all stories or aren't all data sets that lend themselves to be visual. I think also thinking about sometimes just a list of the top 10 or things like that are just as impactful, but thinking about when are there opportunities or when are there issues or things at hand that lend themselves to be visual and kind of exploring what makes sense, whether it's a map or a chart or a table. Um, Great, Charlie. I'm gonna come back to that and we'll come back to the end because I think um, there's kind of lots of different ways to do it. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. Great. Second one I'll talk about is more graphics that are kind of not complicated, not scrolly, just kind of standard bar charts and line charts, but thinking more about this category of maybe a complicated topic that's worked with an expert. This was a project that I worked on at Council on Foreign Relations with a humanitarian expert there, of taking some analysis and some work that he had done, talking about how 2025 was one of the biggest reductions in global humanitarian aid the world had seen, and thinking about what is this story through kind of using charts to kind of have the main takeaways here. And so this is an example where this was a combination of text and graphics in which they're all kind of pretty standard chart types. There's bar charts and line charts and things like that that you might see other places. These are all made on data wrapper, so there was no like kind of fancy technology used on this one. But this is one in which I think um, was important to kind of be able to kind of see the topic at hand in graphics. I think sometimes, especially with huge numbers, it's hard to understand when you're thinking about comparisons between countries or kind of what the scale is. It's something that's difficult. And so thinking about where there are opportunities to take kind of maybe a written text or numbers that you see or numbers out of kind of a complicated report and kind of figure out what are the main pieces that are really going to help people dig their teeth into this or understand what's happening. And so these are just a few that were, again, kind of on the simpler side, and that these are just a few lines or a few bars, but really thinking about how do you think about the context at hand to be able to take something a little bit more complicated and simplify it.
Yeah, Austin, I don't know if everybody can read that green line at the bottom right is Halloween candy spending. Am I reading that right?
Yes, this is how
Yeah. So that
consumer Halloween spending for like each of the years, and last year humanitarian funding for the whole United States fell below how much people spent on Halloween
yeah,
candy.
so I think that's just such a great illustration of the storytelling that goes into this, like when you're like, oh well, this you could look at this and be like, these are just numbers, all you've done is make a graph here, but this storytelling component of thinking about how can we put this into a context that's relevant for people, how can we think about a number that will really shock people but also explain things in a really concrete way. I think that's such a great, it's a really nice example, even though it's incredibly depressing.
Yes. Yes. Very, it's sad humanitarian work currently, but and the graphics or the original sources for all of these are linked in these slides, so can go back and look at these, but I'll keep moving on. I'm gonna skip this slide. I think
See a couple
sometimes
questions.
they're,
I
oh
just
yeah,
sorry to interrupt you. I see a couple questions in the chat, which maybe you want to take now.
cool, cool, yeah. Great. So definitely not a silly question. What tools are you using for visualization on your computer to share something publishable and shareable? Totally good question. I think it really depends on what platform you're using. I think going back to some of these tooling, I think they all unfortunately have a little bit of a different like level of sophistication to what it could be. I think at the simplest level of sophistication is that any of something that you make in Python or that you make in Data Wrapper or you make in Figma, at the end of the day, you can take a screenshot of it or export it as an image and use that. And I think that is like easy and simple and gets the job done. Like I've mentioned, I think sometimes there's challenges with how does this look on mobile or does it resize correctly if people move their browser window and things like that. But that is definitely the easiest, simple way. Um, Kind of the next step up, things like Data Wrapper or Flourish, some of these charting tools and libraries have things that allow you to what's called embed these graphics into a web page. I can go into a lot more detail of this another time, but basically they give you a link that's basically a link that you can use that you can put onto different sites. A lot of things like WordPress or some of these like blogging sites. I don't think Median or Substack have a way to embed things like this, as far as I know, but I have not used them super recently, so that could be wrong. But um, other types of platforms allow you to embed these graphics that allow you to make them, interactive where you can hover over them and they have tooltips and things like that. And so in Data Wrapper, they have guides and instructions for things like that. And then kind of on the more complicated side, when you're doing more web development, there's ways to be able to kind of embed the code that you're working on through D3 and like host the page. If you get more into like web development or building websites, there's things like GitHub pages or other platforms that allow you to host web pages for free that you can make things on. And so if you're making kind of the whole website yourself or using, generative AI to help you as well. There's ways to be able to host that code for free so that it can go to a URL so that you could create it and publish it and I can type in the URL and get into it. There's a little bit more steps involved with that, but happy to share some guides or some resources to that at some point as well. Process to figure out how to create your visual to be the most impactful. Yeah, totally. I think this is hard, and I think this is something where it's not something that you do um, all at once and that it always lands. I think this is something where being able to think about some of these initial questions, like I had mentioned earlier, like starting from not what is the visual, but who am I making this for? What is the point I'm trying to make? If someone sees this visual, what is the one sentence takeaway that I want them to have? And using that as kind of your guiding light. I think that's kind of the first part to start. And then I think second, it's a lot of exploration. So this is where doing things like pen and pencil is really helpful, looking up what other people have made. Some tips at the end I have in terms of just like being a really avid consumer of like cool things on the internet is something that I always recommend to people. And I have some places that I go to find cool stuff, but reading, people that you like or publications or websites or things like that of people that you think make cool stuff and start looking up like I'm working on a story about healthcare or about solar or about recycling. Like what else have people done on this and kind of what visuals exist and what's compelling to me. And then I think, being able to do some quick prototyping. These are things like maybe making a mock-up in Figma or something like that, maybe using generative AI to make like a first version of it or something. I think for prototyping that can be helpful. And showing it to people. I think like the best test ever is like, your friend that's not really do this type of work, like show them and is it like, what's your takeaway? Or show it to your mom or parent or family member or something and be like, what do you make of this? And so I think uh, finding someone that's kind of in that audience that you're writing to and getting their take on it with drafts, I think are really helpful. And then yeah, I think being cognizant of the design layer as well. Kind of what colors are you choosing? What are you drawing attention to? Are you able to read everything? Are you adding maybe annotations to direct someone's attention? I'm trying to see if there's an example of this one. There's not. example of annotation. Maybe another graphic there is in this article, but things like that I think are all like parts of trying to figure out what's the most important. And so I think there's not necessarily like a formula to follow, but I think those are maybe some of the pieces that I think about. And I really think like reading other stuff and keeping track of what you like, I think always got good advice of, every time you see a graphic, take a screen, if you like it, take a screenshot and have a Google Doc that's super long and write a little sentence and the link to it of being like, oh, this annotation felt really impactful, or the way they used color here was great, or like, oh, I like they use this chart type or things like that. So I think kind of building that, you start to kind of pick up some of those things. All right. Great. I left this slide in here. Sometimes people ask me like, how should I label stuff on a chart? I think there's a million different ways to do it. I think sometimes like pick one to start with is helpful. This is how we do them at CFR. I like how we do them. The title is the takeaway. You should be able to read the title and be like, what's the takeaway? Oil prices kept rising despite a reversal on Iranian and Russian sanctions. I work on a lot of not fun topics. But the subtitle describes the data. So like, what is the data you're showing? This is for crude oil price per barrel in March 2026. You can have some optional annotations to add context. Make sure you have clear, large access labels and always include a source as best you can. So these are just things, some like quick formula if you need like want to start somewhere with making a graphic and kind of what pieces do you want to include, like to just recommend this. Great. And then I think just another category of graphic, just gonna keep running through these, gonna go a little quicker now, is I think something that's immersive but simple. This is one in which there's a scrolly. I'm gonna go to this one actually. This is a map that's just basically, Central and South America and a few points. And this is one in which there's some bubbles on it. This is a static map. This uses a little bit of JavaScript to make the maps bigger, but this is one in which is pretty simple. There's just basically the bubbles getting bigger and the year changing, and then showing rise of China trading with South America compared to kind of the US still being more dominant in Central America, but less so in South America. So this is one in which pretty simple and kind of has this more immersive scrolly telling effect, but the visual does not have to be something crazy and complicated. This is just a map with dots on it. This could have been 3 or 4 static maps as well. And so another example of kind of just different ways you can think about it. This is using this great tool called AI to HTML that the New York Times made many, many years ago. This is Adobe Illustrator, not AI today, but can go more in detail. But this allows you to take kind of those Illustrator or more static graphics and make them easier to view on the web as well as interactive. And there's Jonathan Soma from Columbia who has a great guide on this that I linked here as well. Great. Okay, we're at 4:45. I'm just going to jump through a few of these. These are kind of more smaller personal projects just to get ideas flowing or see stuff. Sometimes my favorite articles that people do are just like they found one interesting data set and then they made a whole story about it and they just explained it to me. And so I wanted to try to do this. This was a data set from the Biden administration that was basically every AI use case for the federal government. So every department in the US government had to submit how they were using AI. And so this was about, I forget what the total number was. I want to say like 600 different individual use cases by every department. And this was an article using D3 and kind of an own website that's hosted on GitHub pages that I mentioned earlier. I just basically walk through the data set and say like, here's one use case and here's what the information they give you. Here's them split up by department. Here's them split up by which ones are in use, which is basically just the categories that they gave me. And I added a little bit of context, explained what machine learning was, explained why, there was some lack of transparency that might be good. But this whole story just came from basically one data set that I hadn't seen anyone talk about that I found on the internet. And so this is an example that I think it can be really helpful when you're thinking about, you don't have to have something where you're have some new novel data set or you're joining things together, but it can just be kind of this idea of finding something that you find interesting and being able to kind of walk readers through it.
Yeah, I think this is also partly because of it's very text based and these like sort of repeated images and like repeated structure of illustration. I think this is another example where you could have it in this like D3 JavaScript, but you could also even imagine this just as a slide deck, and then posting the slide deck and hosting that on a website, or as a way to have like a visual communication of a data story, but using like extremely simple, very accessible tools. I really like that as another kind of way of thinking about that storytelling.
Totally, totally. This is kind of a more kind of weird, complicated project I did, but I think sometimes a project is just like an excuse to learn a new skill. I had never done anything with like hardware before. A friend had given me a Raspberry Pi, if anyone's heard of these things. They're basically like mini computers. They're like this big. Um, they're hilariously more powerful than like what NASA used to go to the moon. But yeah, here we are with them, in my apartment. And so this was one where I wanted to basically learn how to use this to be able to hook up a camera, and I have it just point out my window of my apartment, takes a picture of the sunset every 5 minutes, like before and after, and it picks the best one, and I can look at it on a website. And so this was, I think, sometimes like there are opportunities where like I had never touched a computer kind of thing. I had done software stuff like that or other things, but I had never worked on hardware. And so sometimes this was just like a idea I had had long ago before I did tech stuff. And then years later, I was like, oh, I think I could actually do this now. And so this was one where just to kind of give another idea of sometimes I think good projects cannot even be about like like I just made my own data. I was interested in this. I kind of made this for myself. I I don't think anyone's ever looked at it, but I think it's fun. And I think I got a lot out of it that I've used in other projects in the future.
I have a friend who built a Raspberry Pi to track when their cat went in and out of their cat door. And then the problem was that anytime the cat went out through a window or a door that wasn't the cat door, like the cat being in the house or out of the house would be completely wrong. So it was also it didn't matter to anyone else, but it helped them learn about building something off of hardware too. So yeah.
Absolutely. A new respect for how many variables you have to account for because you can't control how the world works, which is very interesting. I also think making a game is always fun. I played a lot of video games when I was younger. I don't really anymore, but I like kind of games. I recently moved back to New York City and was really interested in learning more about their open data, and I make graphics for a living. So I was like, New York Times years ago did this graphic where they give you a data set and you had to draw the line. And I was like, man, that sounds so fun to probably only me and no one else, but that would be cool to figure out how to make. So spend some time also thinking about like, oh, what are some more weird ways to think about graphics or data? And so built this little game where it doesn't quite work anymore because it was a lot of upkeep, but the idea was that it was a Wordle type game where each day it gave you a new data set and you had to guess the line of basically how the data was. This is this population of New York City. It's actually gone up. It hasn't gone down. So this was another one as well. But I think thinking about like again, just another idea that I think is thinking about using data and visualizing it and letting people interact with it. Sometimes not only showing people a chart, but allowing people to kind of explore their own assumptions about the data is another way that can be really interesting and a way that can get people invested in topics and also be an interesting way to be able to help people help understand stuff. I think people have a lot of conceptions about the world or about their community about an issue, and so sometimes having them prove it or show it can help people kind of understand where their gaps are in learning. Great. Okay, we're at 4:50. I'm just gonna go over some quick tips here, and then we'll can leave the rest of the time for anything more we want to dive into. Like I've said, I think really like number one tip is like if you like something, try to just be like an avid consumer. I think that's how you like learn the most. I've linked some places that I go to probably daily to find inspiration. There's a journalist at I don't remember, he has Philadelphia Inquirer maybe, who made this Blue Sky bot where he has a bunch of like um, big newsrooms and it tweets like every time there's a new interactive article. And so it's really easy way to just kind of like see what people are making at all the big newsrooms and I can go look and get caught up. Flowing Data is another like newsletter. This guy, I forget his name, Nathan something, basically just like runs an aggregator where every like week he emails you and it's like a bunch of data viz and like graphics and articles and cool stuff that people are doing on the internet. Um, like I said, I'm more in the news world. I think Reuters does like super high produced, very well designed graphics on really interesting. They're often really short too, which is kind of interesting, but they're very nice. And so if you want like crazy stuff, the New York Times has maybe the most innovative and biggest graphics team out there. I think they do a lot of really, really cool stuff. The Upshot is their kind of civics data journalism offshoot that I really like. I don't know how I forgot to put The Pudding on here. The Pudding is another visual storytelling website in which they do just weird stuff. Like I think they really push the boundaries of what visual storytelling is on the web, and so I'll add that. I've added their resources here. I think really like in an age of AI, really thinking about like how you can think about reading human-made guides can be really helpful. I think there's lots of really good resources on the internet from lots of smart people, and I think they end up just being much higher quality. The pudding has a bunch of cool storytelling stuff. Just a self plug, but there's lots of other stuff. I made like a scrolly telling guide a few months ago, and so there's another example of things like that. I think finding mentors is really helpful. This is two that I've always found really helpful. Two places. DVS is the Data Viz Society. They have a mentorship program that's really great where you can get paired with someone and work on a project with them, kind of like this program. I've done it once, got a really good out of it. News Nerdery, if you're into journalism, is basically like everyone in journalism that works in tech or data viz is on a Slack channel, and it's super active and people ask questions and stuff. So that's another great place to go. And then just make stuff. I think this took me so long to get over. Like, make bad things, make good things, make things no one sees, make things you want to post on the internet. But I really think, with creative work, with kind of finding stuff that you're excited about, with learning, I think the more you can just try things and kind of take off the self-critical lens, if you're that type of person, is really just like the way that you grow and, continue to do stuff and create things that you like. So that was a ton of information. I'm going to pause there. Um,
Oh, that's incredible. Thank you so much. Yeah, if people have more questions, drop them into the chat. Um, yes. Okay. Austin, I'll let you take this.
well, let me stop sharing and pull this up. Okay, cool. Yep. Betting level oversight, which one framework, ambitious, we're gonna map queues. Great. So we can look up. Sorry. Totally. Great. Okay. So that sounds like a super cool project. Very interested. Happy to be helpful if we want to get more into the details. But I think this question of like, how do we decide which software to use? Maybe I'll talk about more broadly. Great question. I think it's always a hard problem to answer. And I think it's more of a question of like constraints, if that makes sense. Like, I think oftentimes you don't have all the time in the world, you don't have all the resources in the world. You're probably not going to pay some platform. Um, you may also bring some expertise. And I think the best projects, especially for learning, kind of are a mix of tools that you know how to use and some that you don't, where you have a little bit of comfort but stretched a little bit. And so I think sometimes it's just like mapping out, no pun intended, like what are the options and what are the constraints and being able to figure out like where's the sweet spot. You could be completely wrong after you start diving into it, but I think starting there of being like, how much time do we have? What skills do people bring? What are new things that I want to learn? Where are there like things that I know I'm going to use where I can get help? Like someone I know would be able to help answer questions for me. And so I think there's like a mix of all these pieces. And so I think like being able to search around, I think for a project like that, I think like with mapping stuff, um, Map Libre, which is like an open source version of Mapbox, like those are by far the two most popular JavaScript based online mapping platforms that are used. And so I think things like you're going to find lots of resources, lots of people use them, they work well, are like good options. But I think it's just like, where's the ambition level? If you're like, I've never written JavaScript before and I know this is, so I'm gonna have to both learn JavaScript and learn this thing and figure out how to put it on a website, then maybe it's like, okay, maybe that's not something that's feasible in 4 weeks. And I want to go with data wrapper map, or I want to do with an Illustrator map, where I want to make kind of a simpler one and something. And so those are just some thoughts.
Yeah, and to Austin's point about like looking for examples and like a lot of people tend to build in public as well. And so if, for example, like it says you're building your website on Framer, um, maybe there's like putting those two search terms together, App Libre and Framer, to make sure you can see are these tools that people are using together? And if so, are there examples of work that they've done that I can borrow from or that I can at least see there's enough evidence of being able to work with these two tools in an interconnected way, I'll be in a good spot.
Anything else?
Yeah, what other questions do folks have? They could actually be also about, it was really good to hear more about Austin's like career, your like this, different things that you've worked on and how one thing led to the other. Yeah, so people should feel free to ask questions around that as well. We only have a few minutes left, so I don't want to open the floodgates too wide.
Yeah, totally.
And Austin, you're on the Discord now too, right?
I am on the Discord, yes.
Okay,
And
great.
if I can, I don't know if it makes sense to post the slides there, if there's a certain channel.
Yeah, so what we've been doing is we've been putting all of our recordings and material, so any slide decks or other materials, into a centralized spot. So we'll do that, and that'll all get linked. I think today, at the end of the day, there'll be like every day we try to send out like a recap of here's the stuff that got shared, so that not only the folks who are here now, but everybody who's not able to attend live can catch up and see the materials.
Sweet. Just put my name and my email.
Great.
Feel free to send me an email or find me on LinkedIn and message me there. I just put the slides as well. I think I see
Excellent.
people on here, so I think you should be able
Yeah,
to access them.
that's great.
Like I mentioned, there's links in the slides for the code, and then in like the notes, like below the slide, are some links to like the actual projects if you want to look at them. So, cool. Anything else?
Okay, last call for questions before we wrap up. Okay, well, I just want to say thanks again to Austin, and I really appreciate you making the time and being up for and like game for this, particularly for these like new programs when we're building this as we're going. And so it's really fun to see the enthusiasm from other people excited for programs like this to exist, and to give their time and expertise and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, just thanks so much.
Totally. Yeah. And I'm super excited to hear projects. I love talking about this and work on this. And so, yeah, please feel free, send me an email, send me a question. I'm more than happy to chat more in detail about any projects or ideas or things like that.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm gonna close the. Actually, I think Kathy has to do it, but
Yeah, I'm here. Thank
we're
you
gonna
so much,
close.
Austin. These slides are so great. I think they're going to help a lot of people. So thank you again. Really appreciate it. All right. See you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.